Good morning, everyone. The idea of Thanksgiving. Do you know Harvest? I was having a look at Harvest, and actually the Harvest service is actually relatively modern. It only dates back to about the 1840s, which is, some of you are probably only old enough to remember that. But it's relatively modern. But the idea of Thanksgiving goes back a long, long way. And that's what I want to look at this morning. And like Steve said, I really think today it's a longish platform, but what I'm trying to do is I want to lay a platform here so that after I finish speaking, people feel that they want to come and publicly say thank you to God. And I'll explain some of that in the long run. Okay. So we're going to start with Psalm 107, if I could have that up, John, please. And we're going to be reading verses 1 through to 9, and I'm reading from the NIV. So we're reading Psalm 107, verses 1 through to 9. And it says this: Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Those he redeemed from the hand of the foe, those he gathered from the lands, from the east and west, from north and south. Some wandered in the desert wastelands, finding no way to a city where they could settle. They were hungry and thirsty, and their lives ebbed away. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He led them by a straight way to a city where they could settle. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and for his wonderful deeds for mankind. For he satisfies the thirsty and fills the hungry with good things. That's a cracker of a passage. The whole psalm is brilliant, so homework again, folks, if you're up for it. Go home and read Psalm 107, because I guarantee you it will bless your socks off. I've preached on Psalm 107 a while ago, but I want to look at this aspect of thanksgiving. And we see the very first thing it tells us is to give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. And the whole psalm, there's 4 scenarios that it lays out. And I've read you just one scenario, but it's a pattern that's followed all the way through. And so this first scenario is of people that were at danger in the land. It was written probably when the Jewish people were in exile and they were coming back to Jerusalem. And these people had been scattered far and wide, and they were brought back from the north, south, east and west. And I look out on our church today, and there are people from, you can tell I'm not a northerner, north, south, east and west, and from all over the world there are people here. God calls his people together, and I think that's just wonderful. But the pattern that we see, is that his people are in trouble. That's the start of all the 4 things. So there's another verse that talks about spiritual difficulties, and another one that talks about spiritual difficulties and rebellion, and then the final example talks about being on trouble on the seas. And each 4 of these, they all start in the same way, that God's people are in trouble. Now, it might be a physical trouble, it might be a spiritual trouble, it might be an external trouble, it might be one that they've caused themselves, but they're all in trouble. So that's the first point. This is the pattern that it follows. They're in trouble. The next point is that they cry out for help. And we see that in verse 6. And then the next thing we see is God's response, and there's a rescue. And it says in verse 7, he led them by a straight way to a city where they could settle. And then the final one is a call to thankfulness. And that's repeated in whatever situation those people found themselves in. And this psalm was really written so that everyone who was there at God's temple could identify with one of those situations. Maybe all the situations, we've all been, if you've lived long enough, you've found yourself in difficulty, haven't you? I think I'm not the only one that's ended up in a pickle in my life, I'm sure. And you find yourself in difficulties. So this psalm gives us a way of identifying what to do in difficulties and to ask God for help, and he will rescue. But then to do more than that, to give thanks. And I think this is just such an important thing. It says, verse 2, it says this, let the redeemed of the Lord, that's you and me. Then it was written to the Israelites, but those of us here today that are saved as Christians, we are the redeemed of the Lord. And it says in verse 2, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. It's not just about being thankful in heart, it's about speaking it out. Verse 22, it says this, let them sacrifice thank offerings and tell of his works with songs of joy. It's a public confession, not confession of wrongdoing, but a public confession of what situation they were in and how God helped them. And they were prepared to stand up publicly and thank God for it. And today, at the end of the sermon, like Steve says, we're going to leave time for people to come and say thank you to God publicly. Because publicly, why? One, because God delights to hear our thanks. Not just know that we are thankful, but actually hear our thanks. But also because when we do it publicly, it has a communal aspect to it. And that right through the Bible, thanksgiving is a communal thing. Yes, we can give thanks on our own, but it has a different aspect and a different power when we give thanks in the community and a communal aspect. And that brings me to Leviticus. We're not going to turn to Leviticus. It's not a book that gets preached from very often, isn't it? And generally speaking, Leviticus is the book that when you're trying to read from the Bible start to finish, you get to Leviticus and a lot of people grind to a halt at Leviticus. So it's not a book that's used very often because actually it goes on a lot about the temple worship and about sacrifices and what offerings you had to bring and at what time and things like that. And you might think, Catherine, what on earth are you going to be talking about Leviticus for? What has that got to do with us in this day and age? But I think it's good because it sets a pattern of thanksgiving that God wants his people to follow. Even though we don't follow the sacrifices, we can follow the pattern of thanksgiving. And so in Leviticus 7, this is where we come across the thank offering. And there were lots and lots of different obligations that God put on his people, the Jews. And they weren't just to make them follow regulations. The idea was that they would be reminded about who God was and what he'd done by the festivals and the offerings that he said that they had to follow. So there are 7 different festivals that they had to have each year, the Jewish people. And it's interesting, if you actually go and look at that, I haven't got time to talk about it now, but if you look at that, 4 of those festivals and what they actually stood for have already been fulfilled in Jesus Christ. The other 3 are yet to come. So it does have an interest in us today. And the sacrifices, there was the burnt offerings, there were the grain offerings, the sin offerings, and the guilt offerings. So lots and lots of different sacrifices. And then there was also the fellowship offering. Now, in the NIV, it's called the fellowship offering, but in some of the other ones, they refer to it as the peace offering. And there were 3 different types of offering in there, and thanksgiving fits in that one. And I can see a lot of blanks, sort of, what are you talking about here? Because, what's this got to do with us? What it's got to do with us is the fellowship offerings or the peace offerings were unique in that they were the only ones where the person bringing the sacrifice shared in the meal. Some of the other sacrifices, the whole offering was burnt on the altar. Some of the sacrifices, they were the scapegoat. It was chased out of Jerusalem into the wastelands. Some of them, it was part of it was burnt on the altar and the priest had the rest. The thank offerings were the only ones, the fellowship offering, which is thank offerings, part of that, they were the only ones which were eaten by the person giving it as well. So there was part on the altar, the best part went to God and was burnt on the altar, then the priest got some, and then the people giving the offering got some. And I just think that's such an interesting thing, because when we think of communion nowadays, it's a fellowship offering, isn't it? It might be completely different, but some of the things that are in the Old Testament, they're what are called types or shadows of what's to come. And this thanksgiving in these sacrifices is we have a New Testament equivalent in the communion service. But I also think it's really interesting because actually a lot of the people in that time, they wouldn't have eaten meat. So those of you that are vegan or vegetarian, I apologise, but they wouldn't have eaten meat regularly. And they were saying that actually some people, when they brought a thank offering, that would be the only time they would eat meat in an entire year. It was a time for celebration. But more than that, the thank offering, when they brought it, it had to be eaten that day. It's a bit like manna, isn't it? It had to be eaten on the day that it was picked up. And I just think, if you are sacrificing a cow, that's a lot of meat, isn't it? The fat and various other bits, the kidneys, were burnt up and given to God because the fat was the best bit. They were given to God. And then the priest got one of the legs and he got the breast. The rest had to be eaten on that by that people bringing it on that day. So you're not going to have a family of just sort of like 5 sitting down and eating a whole cow, are you? It was shared by community. Everyone shared in the Thanksgiving. I don't think I'm wrong there. If you've got a lamb, that's a lot of meat. And it was shared. It was a time of celebration. And one of the commentators said that he actually thought of it as like God hosting in the meal. God has his bit, the priest has his bit, and his believers have their bit. But the whole thing it wasn't done in quiet. It was done publicly so that everyone, they had to follow rules of cleanliness, don't get me wrong, but everyone shared and everyone benefited from the Thanksgiving. And what I am hoping today, when people come up and stand up here today and say thank you to God, that it's going to bless us all. That's my hope. Do you know, we ran we didn't run. I sat in on Paul's preaching course, and Paul and I were listening to people's preaching. And there were people there that you don't normally hear stand up and say something. And it was such a blessing to me. Honestly, it was such a blessing. So what I am hoping today is that when we open this up for people to come and say something, that maybe some newer folk that aren't so established and ancient as some of the other people in church will come up, and you'll be brave and you will give thanks to God so that you can bless all of us here. I am not saying that if you are an old fogey that you can't come up, because you can, of course you can. But I am hoping that people here, there might be 1, 2, 3, 4, I don't know, people that we don't normally hear from. They're prepared to come up and say, God's done this for me. And it will be a public confession of God's goodness that will bless his people. I'm just going to share a verse out of Isaiah. I wasn't going to share this. Well, I prepared it and I was thinking, do I share it? Don't I share it? And I'm going to share it because this is where I've been thinking about Thanksgiving a lot, because I read it recently. And that you turned graves into gardens. This is Isaiah 51 and verse 3, and it says this: "The Lord will surely comfort Zion and will look with compassion on all her ruins. He will make her deserts like Eden, her wastelands like a garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and the sound of singing." And this was Isaiah. He was prophesying to people that were still in exile that God was going to bring them back to Jerusalem. And it was based, if you look in the passage, it was based on God's covenant love to Abraham. It isn't based on what the exiles had done. It was because God had agreed a covenant of love with Abraham. And so it's looking back. They're saying, you might not see where you're going yet. You can't see yourself getting to Jerusalem. But look back at what God did with Abraham, and that's your basis of trust. But also, if you look around the thing in Isaiah, that prophecy, it did come true in part because Jerusalem was rebuilt and there was the sound of thanksgiving. But it hasn't been fulfilled completely, and it does still have a future aspect. And in the same way that Eden was a place of thanksgiving and Zion became a place of thanksgiving, when we join God in heaven, there's an aspect there of that being God's Eden, God's garden, because that's what he planned all along, is to bring us back into fellowship with him that Adam and Eve had, and they gave up when they fell. And so there's a restoration of what was lost. And thanksgiving will be our song. New Testament. The word for giving thanks in Greek, I actually did study a bit of Greek, so I feel not a fraud. You know, when I say it in Hebrew it means this, it means I've looked it up in a book. I have studied a little bit of Greek, but the word for thanksgiving is Eucharisteo rather. And we obviously get the word Eucharist, thanksgiving, communion, fellowship meal. It's made up of eu, which means well, and charis, which means grace. So thanksgiving is our response to God that we are well favoured by him. We see Jesus give thanks. He gave thanks in a lot of things. He did loads of different miracles. You read the Gospels and there's miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle. But actually, it doesn't record Jesus giving thanks very often. The Bible doesn't. But when he does give thanks, something unique happens. He gave thanks before he fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. He gave thanks before Lazarus was raised from the dead. He gave thanks at the Last Supper before he died, and his death was the peace offering that brought us to God. There is something about giving thanks that releases a special blessing. I haven't got time to go into all of that with Jesus, but you can actually look at it yourself. You can find, you don't even need a concordance nowadays. You can Google Jesus giving thanks and it will come up with verses, and you can look at it for yourselves and read it. But I want to just, if we could have the next reading, please, John. We're going to be reading from Luke. And we're reading Luke chapter 17 and verses 11 to 19. Someone relatively recently, I can't even remember who it was, but relatively recently preached on this or mentioned it as a part of this. And this is where the story of when Jesus healed 10 men of leprosy. So it's Luke chapter 17 and its verse is 11 to 19, and it says this. Now on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus travelled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." When he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." Do you know, are there times where you think, "I'd wish I'd been there" in the Bible? I wish I'd been there for this one. Because, we all know that lepers were actually cast out from society. They couldn't come within 50 yards of people. So they had to, and when they did go anywhere and there were people there, they had to shout out in a loud voice, "Unclean, unclean," so that people could scatter. And, leprosy, it can cause horrible, horrible conditions. It's not just that it was a skin condition, it could literally mean that parts of their body fell off because they lost the nerve ending. So, they might not have had fingers, they might not have had ears. It would have been horrendous. The lives they lived would have been awful. But I want to give it to all the 10 lepers, not just this one. I want to give a shout out to the 10 lepers, because Jesus said to them, "Go and show yourself to the priest." And they started obeying him before they were changed. They all had faith and they all obeyed. But this is the bit that I actually be a fly on the wall or a bystander on the road when they're doing that walk. That they're walking along and all of a sudden someone's ear pops back. Or someone's hand that's just a stump has fingers. Wow. One of the commentators said it must have been like a holy madness. They'd have been shunned and despised by everyone. And here they are, literally coming to life again as they walk along the road. And can you imagine what's going through their heads? We need to get to the priest because the priest is going to give us a certificate to say that we're clean. But once they've got that, they can see their family again. They can give them a hug. I was thinking of this. We saw the Jewish hostages. Gosh, the way they were hugged by their families when they hadn't been seen for 2 years. Yeah? They wouldn't have been able to hug their wives, their kids, their husbands. Part of me thinks, I can understand why they didn't go back and say thank you to Jesus. Because they'd been healed and they could resume their lives. But one comes back. And I think the thing is as well is actually, God doesn't demand our thanksgiving, but Jesus says here, we're not all 10 cleansed. Where are the other 9? God doesn't demand our thanksgiving, but he loves to receive it. And then this is the bit that someone spoke on. I can't remember whether it was Paul. It was the fact that this person came back and thanked God. They weren't just healed, but they were made well. And the word for that is sozo, which means they were made whole and they were made complete. And it was a different level. This person that came back received a completely different level of life to the other 9. Steve said this morning that Jesus says that I've come to have life. I've come to give you life, and life in all its fullness. What was the difference that this man had his life completely transformed rather than just he had his healing? The difference was that he came back and he said thank you, because his faith showed him that Jesus was God and he'd done it for him. I'm going to go back to Leviticus, because that thanksgiving offering was part of the fellowship offering. Another word for that is peace offerings. Hebrew word for peace. I think everyone should know Hebrew word for peace, so I'm not trying to say something I don't know. It's shalom. What does shalom mean? Wholeness, completeness. When we publicly give thanks to God, it releases another level of blessing. And I don't know about you, but I want to be blessed in my life. I am blessed in my life. Thank you, God. I am blessed in my life. I want more blessing. I want blessing for each one of us here. I want blessing for us as church, so that people can see that there's something different about us and wonder what it is. And I do think that one of the things that will help release that blessing is if we publicly give thanks to God. Do you know, it's not that we give thanks expecting there to be something else. There will be. We give to God knowing that God will give back to us. But we give to God not because we want him to give back to us. We give to God because we realise he's given us everything already. And we give thanks to God not because we want that extra level of blessing. We give thanks because we have a heart that's full of thanksgiving. And that's what I want. I want my heart full of thanksgiving. To go back to Psalm 107 verse 2, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Thanksgiving is based on what's already been done. It's a public declaration. It's a command. There's a bit in the New Testament, it's in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 18. It says, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. That's a hard one, give thanks in all circumstances, because sometimes the circumstances that people face are horrendous. It doesn't tell us to give thanks for the circumstances, it says to give thanks in it. And actually, it might be that you can only give thanks to God for maybe a tiny weeny bit, but that tiny weeny bit that you're giving thanks for is something that can release greater blessing. So we've got 15 minutes or so I'm hoping there's going to be plenty of people that are going to be willing to stand up and share. Like I said, some of the older people, please feel free to come up and share. Maybe an older person might want, by older person I mean someone who's been here a longer time. Maybe someone will start it off so that a newer person's not going to be scared to come up. But do please leave space open for maybe someone who's never said something publicly in church before now to stand up and say, I want to say thank you to my God. Because that is going to be transformational in that person's life. I'll also say, try and keep it short. Because I don't want it to be just one person speaking for 15 minutes, although I've claimed that privilege myself. Try and keep it short. Try and keep it recent. Okay, so I'm going to hand back to Steve, and we'll see what happens.